Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Maybe Christians don't, in a sense, have a right to mention the word Holocaust or say it out loud, except that our Jewish friends keep telling us that we dare not forget it. I mean, we have to talk about it in those terms. But when it comes to monstrous evil, many of our ordinary schemas for dealing with it, most of our rational thinking really does break down. In one sense, is that one's in the face of gigantic mystery that just is beyond our comprehension.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Ernie Sibley, a local businessman and instructor at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Mr. Sibley will be discussing putting suffering in perspective. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Ernie, I've heard your daughter describe you as a minister without portfolio, sort of an anonymous church person going around doing good for people. And I must say that a lot of times I run into people in this city who have told me that you have helped them and been with them and brought sort of a generous healing presence to their lives. And so it's nice to be able to say that just with you and I sitting here. And
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. I would give some credit, if that is so, to the Episcopal tradition and the Roman Catholic tradition that the laity are also ordained and have a responsibility to ministry equal to or perhaps exceeding that of those who are actually ordained.
Well put, Ernie. Not only a minister without portfolio, but an anonymous theologian. Reminds me of a very important theological trend, what we often call the baptismal vocation, the universal priesthood, the idea that all Christian people are called to share the good news and to be healers of others. I think that's so true. What an appropriate answer. I love that. You do that so well. I love it. And I think that you do go around doing a bit of healing for people, and it leads me into the topic I'd like to talk about, human suffering. And traditionally, it was often talked about under the heading of the problem of evil. And historically, the problem of evil has been an intractable kind of question. No one's been able to figure out any clear answers to that. That's one of the great disturbing things about the whole thing. All religions and a lot of ideologies that masquerade as religions have tried to solve the problem of evil throughout history, and we really don't have any great solutions and any great positions on why all this happens and exactly what you're supposed to do about it. You know, you think of the great religious traditions. You go back to the Jewish tradition, which counseled faith in God. Think of the book of Job. The book of Job, very interesting thing there about, here's Job, or the devil figure, Satan, gets permission from God to tempt Job, sends all his sufferings upon him and so on. And then Job says he rebels against it. He says, well, why is this? How can this be? And his friends come and he give him the traditional wisdom, well, you must have done something wrong. That's why you're suffering. And Job won't buy these easy answers. And he is far from patient. He rails against God. Why is this? Weigh my cause in the balance, he says. Check it out. I'm a good person. I've sacrificed. I've been obedient. I'm a good man. Why is this? Almost demanding from God an answer. And, of course, what we get is really no answer at all. And then this great dramatic piece, one of the great pieces of literature and one of the fine books in the whole Bible, what you really get around is God says, do you know where I keep the snow? Do you know, where were you when I set the foundations of the earth? In other words, what you're getting here is that we're wrapped in a great mystery, that there doesn't seem to be any whys here. What Job is called upon to do is to submit, to say to God, yes, you're running the show. I submit to you. And then as the book of Job turns out, there's a very positive kind of ending to the story. He gets his flocks back, his family, his wife who had turned against him, and so on. So that what you're getting out of Judaism there, I think, is a statement that we really don't have an answer to you. We can't tell you why this suffering is going on. What we can tell you is that submission to God is a helpful way of trying to handle the problem. Well, that's typical, I think, of what you get in all the world's religious traditions. In Islam, they tell them that they'll get to heaven. What does Khomeini tell the little kids who go out to battle? That if they die for their country and the cause of Islam, they will get to heaven immediately. They will enjoy all of the delights of paradise, and so on. You've got in the Eastern religions, I guess you've got this idea of karma and of reincarnation, that the sufferings we undergo in this life are really a product of what went on before. That still doesn't help us understand the root causes of all of this suffering. So I guess what I'm trying to do is just sketch out the fact that we don't have clear answers to this problem of suffering, and we are forced, therefore, to try to find in some way some perspective in trying to deal with it. Ernie, do you want to say anything about that long tradition, or ask me anything about that? I didn't. I just sketched that briefly, you know. Even in Christianity, we don't have a clear answer. Jesus doesn't tell us why this happens. What I think Jesus does is shows us a practical answer to it. That is, he accepts the cross and therefore transforms it so that they're able to say, death, where is your sting? He takes on the suffering, and somehow it leads to good. We're still not left with an explanation of why it is that we human beings have to suffer so much in this life.
And of course, I think the question of why is interesting and provocative, but I'm not sure it's necessary, and no, it's not particularly fruitful in terms of there are no answers available, and the answers that people try to furnish tend to be rather facile and not particularly satisfying to that person who is in pain or suffering or struggling at that particular moment.
Ernie, I'd like to call your attention to a book that I have read, and I believe you have read, by Rabbi Kirchner, isn't it? When Bad Things Happen to Good People, I think the title is. Do you want to comment on that book at all in the light of this question of... I think what we're trying to do is find some sort of wisdom to bring to bear on this question, some sort of perspective that we would have in mind in trying to end up dealing with this problem of suffering. I know that book has sold a lot of copies. And
very popular,
yeah.
And I think it's been helpful to a great many people. As a would-be helping person, I have some problems with it, particularly, I think, perhaps in terms of the way it is used. I know that a great many people give it as a gift to somebody who has lost a child, or give it as a gift to somebody who has just gotten a diagnosis of cancer, that somehow the gift of this book will relieve them of pain and suffering. And my experience is that the book does not relieve pain and suffering. Perhaps the idea of the gift and the other person's concern is helpful on the pain and the suffering, but the book itself can often be used as a denial mechanism. If you are suffering and in pain and I give you a book, it's my way of saying to you non-verbally that I really don't want to grapple and get down there with you and your pain. Here, take the book. I hope that will do it.
I see what you mean.
That, of course, is not Rabbi Kirchner's problem. My suspicion is that the primary motivation for the book was to provide his own necessary catharsis after the experience of the death of his son. And that is certainly valid. And
he draws on that experience so well, doesn't he? I mean, I think that there are a lot of psychological insights in the book, surely, that are helpful. And but the rabbi is dealing with a personal question. I'm a little foggy in the details, but his son had a horrible disease, didn't he?
And died 14 or 15 years of age, I think, and it was obviously a terribly difficult experience for the parents. And particularly a person of faith has their faith rocked to the foundations by that experience, and Kirchner was attempting to find out for himself, answer his own questions. The problem for me becomes one of the two levels of suffering, an intellectual level and an emotional level. And my experience is that if I find answers for the intellectual level, it doesn't solve the emotional level. It doesn't touch the emotional level. He was attempting and did find some answers which perhaps were satisfying to him intellectually. But whether that absolved him of the emotional pain and suffering, I'm not sure. Perhaps yes, but perhaps no. It was curious to me in the book that nowhere was faith mentioned. And from my point of view, and I suspect perhaps yours, intellectual will take you so far in moving toward the mystery and an understanding of the mystery and the mysterious ways in which God manifests himself. But at some point, the intellect, our earthbound questions fall short. There are no answers, and the gap is filled by faith.
Mm-hmm.
And how does one arrive at that? Not usually from a book.
Yes. Yeah, that's, I think, a point well taken, for sure. I think that, as you were talking about Rabbi Kirchner, I couldn't help thinking about another rabbi, Rabbi Rubinstein, who wrote the book After Auschwitz, and dealing here with monstrous evil, the Holocaust, the death of 6 million, and I suppose we could think of things like the tragedy in Cambodia or the Gulag in Russia or the torture of political prisoners and so on as being examples of monstrous evil, or the dropping of the atomic bomb, where the mind really does just blank out, where you just it won't wrap around it, it can't penetrate it. Rabbi Rubinstein, says after Auschwitz, is there any faith? Is it possible to believe anymore? And I think at that point in his life came up with quite a negative response to that question. Maybe that's one reason why the rabbis would be a little leery of, coming up with too facile a faith, especially when you're dealing with the Jewish experience in the Second World War and with the monstrous evil that is at stake there. So maybe they don't want to have too easy a faith, or something that just bypasses the terrible, grim realities. I think sometimes my feeling is that the only thing that we'll do in the face of that is silence, that maybe it's not right to say anything. Maybe Christians don't, in a sense, have a right to mention the word Holocaust or say it out loud, except that our Jewish friends keep telling us that we dare not forget it. I mean, we have to talk about it in those terms. But when it comes to monstrous evil, many of our ordinary schemas for dealing with it, most of our rational thinking really does break down. In one sense is that one's in the face of gigantic mystery that just is beyond our comprehension.
Yes, I agree that the difficulty I feel in grappling with the gigantic proportions of something like the Holocaust. Silence, truthfully, someone said that great souls suffer in silence. Well, I think possibly that good helpers respond with silence in terms of grappling with particular portions of suffering, and that it is too easy to come out with words of solace when the words of solace don't have the size to match the suffering or the pain, but the risk, the willingness to share in silence with the other person what they are going through.
Ernie, when I was thinking about so often when I'm dealing with people who are involved in less monstrous evil, I mean evil that sounds more manageable or suffering. I didn't finish something I said earlier. I started to say classically, we've talked about the problem of evil. That's the way Augustine approached it. He talked about physical evil and moral evil and so on. But really, I think the better phrase for us today, what we're more attuned to, is human suffering. It puts it in more personal terms and something we're able to grapple with. I mean, we're talking about people feeling anxious because they're unemployed, people fighting mental anguish. We're talking about people dying of cancer, of people suffering pain. As I'm talking about this, I'm seeing faces. I'm seeing faces of a man in a nursing home who's on kidney dialysis and has had a stroke and is paralyzed on the left side. A man of great spirit and a man who I've known for a while and who is bright and inquiring and so on. And here he's being dehumanized in a way. I mean, I don't want to overplay that. I mean, it's because he maintains his spirit, but that's suffering. It has a human face. You don't want to talk about it in the abstract, in a sense. I'm thinking about a woman who I was talking with who, was grieving over the death of a loved one and so on, and just the utter cries, the pain from the depth of her being that was coming out as she talked to me about this. I mean, that's what I'm hearing, and And I think what we need to keep in mind in talking about suffering, and that's why there can't be any easy kind of answers. But I think that what I do find myself saying, I think a lot of times to people dealing with suffering, has to do with the one word which I will call perspective. I think perspective, it does do something positive or something we're supposed to strive for as we face our own personal sufferings. I mean, sometimes people who are suffering terrible anxiety over going for a job interview simply need to be reminded, hey, you went through 4 other job interviews and you survived. You can do this again. No, or somebody is suffering from a cold, as we say, the cold ends. I mean, sometimes there's perspective points that can be brought to bear on questions like this. Someone's unemployed, and it's possible to say, well, maybe you will get a job down the road here. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I agree with that. I had some concerns about it, too. Perspective is, of course, very important. The would-be helper has to be nervous about using some sort of placebo that comes out like every cloud has a silver lining, or, well, you have no shoes, how about the man who had no feet? In terms of putting down the other person's pain or suffering and the validity of that pain and suffering at that time, I think it's important to help them put it in perspective over time. But I'm often concerned that an immediate attempt to put it in perspective can tell them that they don't have the right to hurt over what they're hurting over right now.
Yeah, very insightful and sensitive, Ernie. I think that, it corroborates part of my experience. I mean, most times when I have tried to help people to do better because of, by comparing with somebody else, it's not worked, I must say. In other words, your idea of I had no shoes and complained until I met someone with no feet. I mean, I notice that people usually will get angry over that kind of intervention, and very often it's not very helpful. Now, I grew up in a family where I think it was different. Somehow I feel as though I was trained differently in that. My father used to insist that we compare ourselves in bad times with people who were worse off and not with people who were better off. And maybe I sort of learned that as I went along, and it does seem like an effective device to me. I mean, I use my sister that way, I'll be honest. I mean, a lot of times I feel harried and, feel pressed, and people want a part of me, and they, demand this and that and everything. In fact, I've been through some of those times recently. This is sort of a mental, emotional kind of suffering. And I think of my sister in New York with 4 children, and I have scenes in my mind where she's really pressed. I mean, they're on her every minute, and she has no respite from it, and they're demanding and competing for her time, and she's running here and there doing all that. Somehow that does help me. Now, we're dealing with a minor bit of suffering there and discomfort. And so I don't know, I'm mixed on it. I mean, it does help me. I used it in a sermon not long ago, and some people came up to me afterwards and said, well, that helped them. But I know on an individual basis, when I've tried that, it doesn't seem to work.
I think the perspective for a person is tremendously useful, the ability to put suffering in perspective. I'm not sure that it's available to me externally, and I'm sure I tend to resist it when somebody wishes to inflict it on me from outside. If somehow I've assimilated the ability to use perspective into my being, then yes, I'm able to do that and feel good about it, and I know I'm able to do that personally. But I've also experienced people trying to help me by giving me what works for them, and that doesn't mean it will work for me. Their sense of perspective probably is not my sense of perspective, and vice versa. One thing when I worked in the crisis phone, and I recall people calling me and talking about a particular situation and a great deal of pain they were feeling. After talking with them for a while and making contact, I would learn to say something like, have you ever felt this way before? Oh, yeah, I felt this way about 10 years ago. Well, what did you do then? Oh, well, I called Uncle Charlie, and we went up to northern Michigan and went fishing for a week, and it was great. Well, have you thought about calling Uncle Charlie now? No, by golly, that's a great idea. I'm going to call Uncle Charlie. So perhaps people in suffering do have some tunnel vision, and after we make contact with them and they feel we are with them in their suffering, then perhaps we can help them develop their own perspective and gather their own coping mechanisms, restore the coping mechanisms perhaps they had before they went through the situation.
You know what I get out of that, what you just said, was that a whole lot of it depends on the approach that you use in offering the perspective, that the initial trust that is established, and also the precise methodology for getting them in touch with the perspective. You said that it's not a matter of imposing it from without, but getting them to discover it from within, and then if you have the habit of seeing things in the larger picture, it's going to help you. That's what I mean. The way you describe that's terrific. That's the way it's going to make it, or it will come across. And then people are able to say, well, they almost thought of it themselves, or they made it their own, or they're drawing on their own resources.
Yes. So earlier in the program, you said something about I went around healing, and that was very flattering and very nice. But I'm sure you would agree with me that we don't heal people. We try to provide a context and help them find their own skills and the energy, the ability they have to heal themselves. And all we do, which is doing quite a lot often, is providing that sort of context to help them get in touch with that themselves. They have the spirit, the essence within them to heal themselves. Mm-hmm. They have God within them, if you wish to call it that, to help them with the healing. I can't heal you, you can't heal me.
You know, Ernie, I was thinking about one of the figures in history who's really tried to offer perspective on the whole problem of evil, and that was St. Augustine, who's so influential in much of our Christian thinking. Augustine felt that God was like an artist who was painting a great picture, and that the picture had to have dark spots in it as well as light for it to be a beautiful whole. It's often called the aesthetic solution to the problem of evil, that from God's standpoint, it all makes sense. This earthquake here, this woman with cancer here, all of the various difficulties, sufferings of the world, that all of that is simply part of a grand plan, and that it is moving things forward to the completion of the fullness of Christ, where it's all brought together one day. Now, I think that that position of Augustine, that our problem is that we see it from a limited perspective. God sees it from the highest standpoint, sees the whole of it, and therefore knows how it all fits together. Our problem is we're down here at a lower perspective, see only the immediate suffering, and therefore can't fit it into the larger schema. Now that, I think, is, as I said, one of the great efforts in history to get some perspective in general on the problem of evil. Now that, I notice that people will use that at times. It comes out in language like this: well, I don't understand why this is happening, but it must be for some larger purpose. Or, I can't figure all this out, but God knows what he's doing. Or something like, I think God can bring good out of all of this suffering. I was talking to a man in a hospital not long ago. He said something like, he says, how is it? I mean, what's it feel like? And how are you going through this? And he says, I'm just trying to accept it all. He says, I don't understand any of it or why is this happening. I'm trying to accept it. I think that God has some purpose here that I don't understand. Well, there's an exemplification, I think, of this traditional viewpoint that Augustine taught us, which is a perspective point. That the perspective is that ours is limited, God's is all-encompassing, and that we have to remember that.
No, I suspect it's difficult to trust that while I'm feeling great pain or suffering a great deal. I would like to be able to trust it. Once again, I would be nervous about people laying that on me.
Mm-hmm. Your voice is going, Ernie. Do you want me to talk for a while so that you can... that's not hard for me to do, is to talk for a while. Are you getting that back?
Yeah, I'm sure there's power and value in suffering, but I'm nervous about the idea of telling that to people who are suffering. I think it's terrific when they're able to find that for themselves. The Catholic Church has a doctrine of redemptive suffering that you might talk about. That would be helpful to me.
Well, I think that one has to be careful of that, but the general model for that is Jesus Christ himself, who has taken on all of the darkness of life, was rejected by his friends, an innocent man executed as a criminal, and he ends up triumphing over that. That by taking on the cross, he empties himself, becomes obedient, even unto death on the cross, for which reason God has given him a name that is above all names. That this emptying out of himself, this acceptance, has opened him up to receive the grace from God, so that death for him is passageway into a new and richer life. And I think that Christians then take that as the paradigm or model for how life can be dealt with, that life indeed is redemptive in some way, that suffering can be used as a vehicle for moving into a richer life, that the whole paradigm of life is business of death into rising, that Easter follows Good Friday. And so I think we can say that, but only from the perspective of faith. Again, I like the note that you've given throughout, that is, you can't be glib with this. You can't talk easily about it. You can't give easy answers. But I think in the perspective of faith, which is the largest context we try to arrive at, we do end up saying that suffering is redemptive because Christ has made it that. He's shown us that we can triumph over the worst of evils, death itself, and we carry that as part of our faith.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Ernie Sibley, a local businessman and an instructor at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was putting suffering in perspective. Comments or questions on this show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.